Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Seth Green, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to Understanding and Addressing the Epidemic of Inequities, a webinar by the Chicago Urban League and Loyola University's Baumhart Center. On behalf of Loyola, I want to welcome all of you and let you know how important this moment is to all of us at the university. We are very struck by this moment as a social justice institution. As a center, Baumhart has long been focused on the inequities of our country, and in particular, the racial nature of those inequities. And we are deeply committed to being part of the solution as our country finally begins to reckon seriously with the 400-year pandemic that has now coincided with this immediate pandemic. We have had in the works this partnership with the Chicago Urban League, and I want to start by sharing how much we value the Urban League. This is a report that was coming out before this moment really brought our attention. And the reason the Chicago Urban League was writing this report was because they knew that our country had failed to take seriously the racial dimensions of our country as well as of COVID. And so it is truly an honor to partner with them. They are at the forefront of this movement for more than 100 years. And we believe that as we move forward as a country, their voice and their leadership is going to be central to how we are going to be able to move forward. So let me tell you a little bit about our agenda for today, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson, who is the president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League, for the welcome. After she speaks, Stephanie Bechler is going to be giving a strategic report that comes from the Epidemic of Inequities report that the Chicago Urban League put together. And then we're going to hear 3 case studies. The big question that I know everyone is asking is, what can we do? And there are roles for the private sector, for the public sector, and for the nonprofit sector. And so we have Eric Smith, a leader in the private sector, vice chair of BMO Harris Bank. We have David Doig, who has served in the public sector as well as now in the nonprofit sector in a role that brings together all sectors to move work forward. And we have Cornelia Coleman, who is the SVP of External Affairs and Programs at the Chicago Urban League, that felt called by its own report to change and to innovate to try to address this moment. So with that, let me turn it over to Mayor Freeman Wilson and to just say thank you again to her for the opportunity to work with the Urban League, especially in this moment.
Well, first, let me say good afternoon to everyone and to thank you, Seth, for this gracious introduction, you and the Baumhart School as well as Loyola University. It is our pleasure to partner with you, and I am certainly honored to join you with my colleagues, our board chair Eric Smith, our head of the Research and Policy Institute, Stephanie Smith-Beckler, and our director of, or vice president of External Affairs and Programs, Cornelia Coleman. As well as my friend with the Chicago Neighborhood Initiatives, David Doig. You know, you talked about what we saw early on, and I understood simply when there was a stay-at-home order issued in the city of Chicago, and when we made the decision, quite frankly, at the league to remain at home, that there would be a disparate impact on our youth who were in school. We had 100 young people coming through the Urban League every week for enrichment, educational enrichment activity, college prep. We were at that time running an SAT course, and I feared that some students would go home with very developed and involved curricula with technology, and others would go home with a much less involved plan for education continuation. And certainly I don't think anyone knew that it would be as long as it has been, that young people would be out of the classroom. But I knew that with each day, there was a gap that had already existed that was widening. But very quickly, as the health reality of the pandemic set in, we began to see a higher incidence of not only the contraction of the disease, but also death from the disease in the African American community. And while that in and of itself was troubling, what was particularly concerning to me was the fact that so many individuals talked about the unhealthy habits of African Americans leading to the incidence, the higher incidence of COVID-19. And there seemed to be a blame the victim approach, if you will, to their assessment of why the disease was having such a large impact in the African American community. We had already set to have, or at least talked to Stephanie and her team about the importance of trying to document this, trying to get some early findings behind it, because we thought that it was important that those findings inform any policy that was going to be put in place as a result of our response to this pandemic. And, you know, I cannot thank Stephanie Smith-Bechtler, Kathy Kane Willis, Kareem Butler, and Ileana Espinoza Robbie enough for their work, because they turned it around so quickly. And it revealed what we always knew, that it wasn't just the eating habits of Blacks, or it wasn't just some of the poor health habits of Blacks or non-compliance with some of the health challenges, but it was really the factors, underlying factors, and social determinants of health that really paved the way for us to be impacted by the disease. And I'm not going to steal Stephanie's thunder, or certainly give her report, because she does much more justice than I could ever do. But I will say this, if we are going to solve this pandemic, and I think what we've seen in the last month since the death of George Floyd, and since there has been a renewed commitment to not just dealing with a temporal pandemic, but as you have said, 400 years, which have set the stage for this pandemic. I think that this report can be a guide to how we might create lasting change, and how we might impact not just our community, but our entire country to be better, to better steward our help, our support, our responsibility to the Black community, and I would argue also the Brown community, because we have seen an even higher incidence in the Brown community here in Chicago. But the fact remains that it's not just better health outcomes, or it's not just better health care, it's not just better employment opportunities, it's not just better support for small businesses or housing or paying attention to the environment. It's all of the above. And unless we are going to be committed to all of the above, any dollar that we spend towards COVID-19 any dollar that we spend against racial injustice will be a dollar that we might as well throw in the air and run out from under it, because it will be wasted money. So my call, and our team will tell you, I say it every day, if we are not in this to deal with the underlying issues and not to add Band-Aids to a problem that has already been laced with insufficient Band-Aids, then we need to sit down somewhere and not even get in this fight. So thank you for this opportunity. And it is my honor to work alongside of people who are so committed to this work.
Thank you so much, Mayor Freeman Wilson. And I want to now introduce Stephanie. You have set the stage. You have both talked about the roots, and you've said that this needs to have a comprehensive response. And she's tasked you, Stephanie, with no less than a guide that the entire country is looking for right now for how we understand and then address this moment. So you have 15 minutes to give us a guide to a 400-year-old challenge that our country has not yet met. But I have no doubt that you will meet that ability with the report that I've already seen and been truly struck by. Let me turn it over to you.
Yes, so no pressure there. No pressure there at all. So thank you, Seth, and thank you, Karen, actually, for the words of support. The leadership of the Chicago Urban League made it such that we could put out this research, and they value research. And I think it's critical to our understanding of the work that we do, not just in this space, but collectively on behalf of the League. So title slide here, an epidemic of inequities. And that's really what we were looking at here. So I've got a couple, in my 15 minutes, I've got a couple of learning goals. You can see those here. I'll just highlight the first one really quickly. In light of the protests that have been going on, in light of the unrest, in light of much of what we've seen across the nation, we're hearing the term racism as a public health issue. So if you'll humor me all for a few moments, I just want to talk a little bit about that, and then I'll roll specifically into the research that we did around COVID-19. But you'll see that it's very carefully and closely tied to the work that we had done around COVID-19. It's all the more prescient and important that we talk about this at this time. So next slide, please. So racism is a public health issue. We'll start there. Next slide, please. I always like to start with the basics. I never like to assume that I've got a public health audience or folks that are sort of aware of the terminology. Public health, as you know or may not know, is really focused on population health. It's on preventing illness and disease, and then really creating a response. And we've seen that with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen efforts to contain, to mitigate, and to really slow the spread. And that's really what public health does. It recognizes, and I think it's important to understand this, that it recognizes that there are these things, you may have heard this term, called social determinants of health, that really influence whether or not people are sickened with a particular illness, how that illness then sort of manifests itself in that person or in the community, and really what the potential outcome is for them. And these social determinants of health may have nothing to do with our body at all, but have to do with where we live, where we work, and what we have access to. And I think it's important to understand that these social determinants of health lead to health disparities. So those are some of the things, right? Those are some of the disparities that I mentioned. But all of this really sits under the big umbrella of health inequity. And that's when we think about this term, racism as a public health issue, I really want us to focus on health inequity and what that means. Next slide, please. So here's the basic. This is my summary of years of research, not that I've done, but others have done. Although certainly I've looked at this myself too, but just mounds of research that has tried to sort of understand and identify, well, what is a health inequity and why does it matter? So when health inequity is really the result, and I want to emphasize this point of human decision making, right? So there are health disparities that can result from genetic or biological differences. And I will lean on my colleagues in medical science and in medical research to explain that much better than I ever could. But we do have health inequities that result because of decisions that we're making in policy and practice. So they are often born of an unequal distribution of power and resources across groups. And those groups can be racial, ethnic, nationalization, so place of birth, immigration, all of those factors are sort of the different groupings that we would see. They are supported by biases, assumptions, and discriminatory beliefs about these groups. And Karen had mentioned some of those at the front end, right? That there can be this tendency to sort of place blame. Well, you didn't exercise enough, or you ate too many Cheetos, and you didn't wash your hands enough. We've actually seen that commentary come out just the other day from a lawmaker. So there's that self-blaming sense of like, you sort of brought this on yourself. And I think the point that I really want to bring up too is that these are unnecessary, avoidable, and unjust inequities. So when we say inequities and when we think about what underpins that, I really want folks to understand that racism is sort of the groundwork or the framework, the ground on which health inequity stands. And that can be a very difficult thing for folks to grasp. It feels a little esoteric, and it's kind of hard to translate that into sort of what we see. This slide was my best attempt, and I changed it about a dozen times before I finally sent it over. But this is sort of my attempt to help people understand, like, this is what we mean when we say racism is a public health issue. So you sort of start at the floor, right? This idea that there are these assumptions or ideas or beliefs or attitudes or ideas about a particular group of people. And I've listed here anti-Black, anti-POC, POC being people of color. So just as a general term, there's many ways we can talk about groups, but I've just sort of chosen that for this example. Those understandings, those biases, those assumptions, those discriminatory ideas can lead to policies or practices or behaviors that then themselves are discriminatory. And it prevents us from really sharing power and decision-making equitably. It prevents us from really allocating resources where we need them, and it can create very punitive environments in which we tend to criminalize things that really are health things, right? So substance use, mental health being some examples of that. So you've got these baseline assumptions, you've got these policies and practices. What that then translates to, and you see that represented in those little dots there, those little bubbles, are inequitably allocated resource or inequitable access to certain things, right? So good jobs, and we could define good jobs in a lot of ways, but I would define that as, you make enough money and you have access to health insurance, and you have some good policies in place to protect you or your family, in the event that something was to happen, that you have access to good transportation, to housing, that you and your community have access to capital and investments that really push things forward and stabilize the economic health of the households and communities. So when we make these decisions that have inequitable resource allocation, what we then see, and we see this in Black communities, and I'll put the caveat too that we see this in Latinx communities and communities where we have a higher number of households with lower income families, that you then have lower family and household income. So you have less money. You have less ability to build assets, to build wealth, to have that cushion to fall back on, so should something happen. You have to make very different survival decisions that really impact your ability to survive and thrive in general, but really stay safe in a crisis like this one. So when we have that, that's sort of all rolling up into these poorer health outcomes. And that's where this conversation in public health is really coming in. So it didn't do, like I said, the world of research on this. I tried to do as much justice as I could, but I wanted to make sure we had that baseline understanding before we moved forward in talking about the report as a whole. So understanding our COVID-19 inequity framework. So what we really did in our paper, next slide please, is we really tried to put together a framework that would help folks really synthesize a lot of what was being said out there in the media, through advocacy groups, through medical institutions, and others that were coming together and saying this is going to impact people in very different ways. The Chicago Urban League, our focus was on Black families and communities. So that was the focus of our framework. But again, I think from this, you can find, if you work with different groups or populations, that there's some similarities, and some of what we have observed here or put forward here can apply to other groups as well too. So I encourage folks to sort of think about how they can use the information in that way. So let me be transparent. We started with the theoretical framework or the guiding philosophy that it wasn't necessarily that Black folks were at greater risk because they were Black. Certainly, again, and I'll lean on my scientific peers in the medical community to talk about how genetic differences and genetic predispositions, I'm hearing things about ACE2 inhibitors and things like that. Can't speak to that. But there may be differences that increase the potential severity in an individual. But we really started with the premise that it wasn't so much being Black, it's that when you are Black in the United States, that means certain things. And it's exposed you to sort of a legacy or history of racism, of residential and economic segregation, and other factors then that put you at greater risk, both of exposure to the virus, and we've identified those as the exposure risks. And then, unfortunately, should you get COVID-19 or should you be infected, that would put you at greater risk of mortality. And when we were thinking about this, we really recognized too that the Black community, Black families, it's not a monolith. There's differences in terms of socioeconomic status. So we really argue that sort of the lower you go down on the sort of the socioeconomic ladder, the more likely you would have these exposure points and probably the greater your chance of mortality. I will say though that there's a lot of research that suggests that sort of across the board, controlling for socioeconomic, Black individuals can have worse health outcomes sort of in general, and for a lot of the reasons that we talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take this time to unpack the two pieces of our framework, both the exposure factors and then the mortality factors, and sort of how we operationalize those. Next slide, please. So we'll start with, here we go. What I wanted to show here in this slide, before I sort of drill down into the details of it, are sort of how we've operationalized exposure risks. And we really thought of 4 kind of primary bucket areas where we thought those risks would fall. One is employment and occupational conditions, so the nature of work and the type of work being worked. Housing, characteristics of housing, how people lived and where they lived. Barriers to social distancing, that has been a big call for in terms of mitigation and containment, but we know that Black families have some barriers, and certainly again, on the lower socioeconomic spectrum, the more those barriers exist. And then we specifically call out mass incarceration as an exposure risk. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go into that area. And then on the mortality risks side, we had 5 sort of primary bucket areas that we believed led to higher rates of mortality, both with COVID-19, but you could make the case in a number of health conditions and health outcomes that these also are a factor as well. One is hypersegregation, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but really talks more about sort of concentrated poverty and sort of concentrated resources in some areas versus lack of resources in another. Poverty, income, and wealth at the household level, certainly at the community level as well too. Healthcare discrimination and access, environmental contaminants and pollution, and there's been some research that has come out and continues to come out about the role of fine particulate matter on your lungs, and then how that can set you up for a worse course of COVID-19 infection. And then those pre-existing health conditions, which at the front end took up a lot of conversation and are part of this, but are part of it because so many of the other things are a part of this as well. So next slide, please. So I'm going to very, very briefly, because I know we're limited on time, I'm going to very briefly talk through those exposure risks. And we have a really great executive summary that's available on our website that really dives into some of this. We've got the full report too, but we'll talk about that in more detail. So those employment and occupational conditions, the thing that I want to emphasize is that we know that there are a lot of Black workers sort of across the spectrum of employment opportunities, but we see a lot focused on those kinds of jobs where you would have a lot of exposure points, which is opportunities where you're connecting with or engaging with people or with the public, right? So travel, and that's things like TSA. Now, airports and airlines have really shifted in response to all of this, but at least at the front end, one of our sort of working theories was, you know, the number of folks going through O'Hare. I don't even know if you ever saw that picture of just the throngs of people that were coming home. And we certainly were concerned about the folks coming home, but we were really concerned about the folks that were working in the airport on that day and the throngs of people that were coming through. So the types of jobs where you'd have more interaction with the public are definitely going to raise your exposure risk. And then I think too, those jobs make it more difficult to do remote working, right? They're based on customer service or based on working in a specific place. And it makes it more challenging then to really execute stay-at-home or virtual working plans. I'll jump ahead to housing too. One of the things that we wanted to really highlight is that there are specific characteristics within the household that might make it harder and may make it more likely for you to be exposed. Intergenerational living being one of those. If you have youth or adults who are out working and working essential jobs, and then you have older family members, there's that risk there as well, sort of that intergenerational transfer. There's what we call doubling up or precarious housing, right? So families coming together, folks coming together, couch surfing, friends spending time on the couch, you know, aunt or uncle spending time in the home. So a lot more movement in and out of the home can introduce more exposure risk. And then I think too, really just the lack of isolation space. There was one study that we referenced where, you know, a lot of families had one bathroom or maybe didn't have enough bedrooms for the family. And so when you think about the call to have you quarantine and self-isolate in a room if you were exposed or if you thought you were exposed, that becomes very difficult for some families. Barriers to social isolation, I won't go into the details of that, but certainly financial barriers. One of the key ones that we think about and have been thinking about is the difficult decisions that families and individuals have to make, recognizing that they cannot afford to give up their income and they cannot afford to stay home, they cannot afford to give up their gig if they're in the gig economy. And so folks have to go through a very careful calculus, right? Because they don't have the assets or the wealth or the financial resources to be able to slow down their income or step back from employment. And they just have to proceed sort of as usual because their income requirements would require them to do so. So we're really concerned about that, as well as technology barriers. So even if you had a job that would allow you to work from home, ensuring that you had internet access, this came up with kids a lot too in terms of completing their studies, but those technology barriers play a role. And then public transportation. So we know that in the city of Chicago, certainly public transportation is used by all, but it is used by a larger percentage of workers that might be going to these essential jobs, may not have a car, and may have to use that as a method of transport. There's been a lot of articles that have come out lately about what public transit will look like, you know, now that we're in COVID-19. And then finally, mass incarceration. It is a sort of a closed environment and a closed system in which it sort of can be a breeding ground for exposure, but also infectivity and passing that on. So we were very concerned about that as well. Next slide, and I'll briefly kind of go over the mortality risks, although not in as great of detail. So hypersegregation, right? Really that isolation and that concentration of poverty and what that would mean then for the individuals living in that community area. And then I think racial discrimination, a lot of ways in which that gets talked about is implicit bias in healthcare. And the research out there that suggests that folks get different types of treatment and experiences in the healthcare system based on the color of their skin, based on their age, based on a number of factors. And certainly that can be at play here as well too. Where poverty, income, and wealth come into play, I think is in part what I talked about earlier about not having that income to be able to ride these sort of shock events and these financial shock events that happen, right? This is about an illness, but then this is not about an illness at all. And so that's, I think, a very big factor, as well as the inability to really get credit or to have enough credit, again, to ride some of these really difficult financial times. Environmental contaminants being another issue, and then the pre-existing health conditions, both the condition itself and how that then increases your likelihood of COVID-19 mortality. So, next slide. So short and long-term considerations. I won't go really deep into details here, but there's a couple of things that I wanted to pull out. You know, we had put together some recommendations in the report, and I wanted to just stop for a moment and think about some more timely ones. One of those was, we're seeing some evidence in writing that workplaces and workforces are going to maybe move more towards contingency worker models. Folks are finding that they're having to lean more heavily on the gig economy. And really, we've noticed too that the need for technological competency, digital access, and digital literacy are sort of more critical than ever. So from the nonprofit perspective, thinking about ways that we provide that to our clients or partnering with others to help us in that capacity is I think, critical. Advocating really for local and state small business loan funds. So we did have the PPP funds, we had the Main Street Lending Plan, but it feels very inaccessible to a lot of small business owners, particularly MBE businesses. Some of the requirements are just not ones that they can meet. So really continuing to advocate there. I think we have to prepare our housing programs for the anticipated influx of eviction clients that might be coming up in the upcoming months, right? So families that have been able to sort of avoid the eviction crisis to this point might find that that's something that will happen with increasing speed moving forwards. We just want to be ready for that crisis. And I'll say this one and then I'll move on as well too. I really want us to start thinking about and be aware of and sort of be on the watch for the rise of potentially predatory financial products or harmful financial products that people will reasonably and rationally in the moment use as means to buffer income losses, but open up a whole world of hurt and financial problems down the road. So we can skip ahead. The final one, I have to put this slide in here because there's the short-term work that we do right now, and then there's the broader long-term advocacy that we at the League do. That I always put in any kind of a recommendation, recognizing that there's so many steps to get here, but reinvesting or investing in Black communities, investing in the public health infrastructure is critical. Healthcare for all, however we determine that and however policy determines that, has to be a critical piece of our work moving forward. As does environmental justice and really looking at environmental racism. Ending mass incarceration, which has had a harmful impact on all communities, particularly communities of color and Black communities. And this racial wealth gap is a significant, I think, driver of why we see some of what we see in these crises. So I know I've gone over, I apologize for that, but I hope that this was a really helpful overview in terms of the work that we were doing and why we think it's critical moving forward.
There is absolutely no apology. That was a truly powerful presentation, and I know that I am grateful. I know our audience is as well. I just want to underscore a couple of things that Stephanie said, and then we're going to move on to case studies on how to address this epidemic. The first is that you should absolutely read the report. So go to the Chicago Urban League's website, download the full report. It has data that really informs all of the themes that Stephanie talks about and gives you even deeper understanding so that you can take action. The second is that everything that Stephanie described is true for hundreds of years. And so there's a really powerful book written before this moment by David Ansel, The Death Gap, How Inequality Kills, that's really centered in Chicago. It looks at an over 20-year death gap between essentially white communities in places like the Loop and Black and brown communities on the West Side. And so all of those factors have long been responsible for an epidemic. It's just taken us until now to fully realize it. And so I just want to underscore how we need to not go back to normal. We need to go to a new normal after this moment for all the reasons that were described. The final piece I'll mention is that as we come to our first case study, Eric Smith, who is sharing insights from the private sector, I think that's where so much of this starts, because you talked about housing, you talked about investment, you talked about employment. We know in the latest job numbers that even though the country rebounded to, quote, 13%, which was better than expected, we actually saw Black communities as the one demographic that took a step back in that latest data because of the different opportunities that you mentioned in your report. So we're really eager to now hear from people that are very thoughtful about this, have been for a long time, and that are reflecting in this moment. Eric Smith is the chair of the board of the Chicago Urban League. He is also the vice chair at BMO Harris Bank, and so I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about how the bank has thought about these issues in many different ways across its portfolio. Eric?
Thanks, Seth. Thank you so much for your leadership in organizing the panel discussion today. It's an honor to be with you. And I also like to thank the fantastic team at the Chicago Urban League, certainly Stephanie and the research that her team has led, and then our esteemed CEO, Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson. I'll start by saying that, why this discussion is so important is because the public-private partnership is really the key to success. We live in one of the best cities globally in Chicago, but the reality is that we do have a systemic racism issue here in Chicago. We see that in just about every sector, whether it's in housing, education, access to capital. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to work together to address those inequities. BMO Harris has a rich history of over 160 years as Harris Bank before it was even acquired by the Bank of Montreal. And so we have been part of the fabric of Chicago for a very long time. And one of the things that I am very pleased is that we fundamentally believe that companies are only as strong as the communities that they serve. And banks serve really as the central part of what drives the economy, what connects workforce development to housing, to education, and to every other component that drives our economy. And so the way we have tried to approach this is, one, through our business practices. And as we think about sort of our business and how we serve the community, we look at making sure that we can show up and be present in all communities, the diverse communities around Chicago. So roughly 25% of our retail branches are actually in low to moderate income communities, which gives us the opportunity to better serve those communities. We focus our business on making sure that we can provide access to capital through lending. And last year alone, we did over $600 million of community development loans across the Chicagoland area. But there's still much more for us to do. We also really task our employees with working with small businesses to provide financial education. And we reached over 11,000 people in terms of really focusing on financial literacy. We also work closely with the consumers and those markets to make sure that we can address issues around the wealth gap. One of the first places that I think you look to in terms of closing that wealth gap is to help to improve home ownership. And so making sure that we can provide mortgage and down payment assistance programs to customers that are first-time home buyers is something that is critical for us. It's also important to make sure that we can work with our customers to make sure that they can stay in their homes. So we offer specific refinancing products to consumers that may find themselves underwater in terms of their mortgage. Those are things that are critical for Chicago and for supporting the communities. While the business side is also very important, there's a huge responsibility that we have in making sure that we're giving back. And we do that through our corporate philanthropy. We try to focus our giving across a variety of areas, including economic development, including education, housing, health and human services, and arts and culture. And I'll start maybe with an example around economic development that I'm particularly excited about because it really reflects what our current mayor, Mayor Lightfoot, is looking to drive in terms of economic revitalization of communities that have been left on the sidelines for far too long. One of the things that BMO announced last year in October was a $10 million investment over a 5-year period in partnership with United Way to support the neighborhood network program that they've established. And that's a partnership that we've been a part of for many years. But to be able to now invest in that initiative to really focus on ways that we can provide transformative investment in education and affordable housing and workforce development is something that is really fundamental to how we provide inclusive economic growth across the city of Chicago. That initiative will be part of what's known as the Invest Southwest plan and will focus principally on the Austin community. And so by being very strategic in the approach that we're taking, we believe that we have a real opportunity to work closely with members of the community, with our city and our elected officials and local not-for-profit organizations to provide a comprehensive approach to community and economic revitalization. If you look at some of the other specific, more recent situations, we're obviously dealing with several crises right now. We're dealing with a crisis around the COVID-19 and the disparate impact that we see, how that has affected the Black and brown community, and what sort of impact that will have on the economy. And we're now also facing the growing racial tensions that we see because of the gross and disheartening tragic events that have unfolded over the last several weeks. And so what BMO has done is to make a specific commitment to supporting the COVID relief efforts that have been established with United Way and the Chicago Community Trust to make sure that we can support the not-for-profit organizations that are at the heart of providing the social services that will be needed during this time of crisis. We have also worked very closely with our small businesses to make sure that we can provide PPP assistance to small businesses. That's really very essential. And over this short period of time, the last 2 months, we have actually provided over $5 billion of assistance through the PPP program and being able to secure that funding for small businesses across our market. That actually represents close to 20,000 small businesses. And as you look at the number of jobs that will help to save, it's roughly 500,000 jobs. Given that we're in a situation right now where we see roughly 40 million plus people that are unemployed, this is a really important initiative for the entire banking community to rally around. And it's important that we do that in a way that's not just for the current crisis, but to also think about the long-term economic recovery of how do we address this going forward. And so we're very excited to be able to work alongside with the mayor and with her task force to look at what that long-term economic recovery package will look like and how the banking community can play a key role as part of that. This will be a multi-year strategy that will require the collective support of the public and private sector. And we are very excited to be at the table to help to think about the solutions that will be most important. I'll also just share maybe a few thoughts as well on the issue that we see around racial inequity. And I'm extremely excited that our CEO here in the US, Dave Casper, wanted to take a bold stand on behalf of BMO Harris to address this fundamental issue. And he reached out to several of our senior leaders. We are fortunate to have a diverse leadership team. And we really thought long and hard about how we could lend our support. And we decided to make a specific $1 million commitment to support the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Equal Justice Initiative, which was founded by Brian Stevenson, to make sure that we can help to support the needed reforms that will be important for our country as it relates to criminal justice and as it relates to police reform and restoring the sense of trust between the community and local law enforcement. And I think that reason why I wanted to point that out specifically is because one of the things that I think helped to make that happen was not only having a CEO that had that sort of commitment and desire to make a bold statement, but the fact that we also had a diverse leadership team that allowed us to have that collective thought on how we could be change agents as part of this. And I think for the banking community, unless you have a leader that is able to lead with a heart, that's not solely focused on return on equity for every transaction that we may do, but is thinking about ways that we can reinvest in the community for the long term, and thinking about that in terms of our hiring practices and our business practices, it's fundamental for our success going forward. So we're very excited to be a part of the public-private partnership that is a unique fabric of Chicago, and we're particularly excited to be able to be partners with the Chicago Urban League and with Loyola University and the Baumhart Center. So thank you so much for this terrific opportunity to join you today.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I just want to say how immensely grateful I am for BMO's comprehensive leadership in this moment. You know, there's the community development, but then there's also the statement. And I read that statement from BMO and was really impressed by the courage and the bravery and the commitment. So we're going to move on to another piece of this, which is, you know, there was the social determinants of health and the community level impacts. And there's someone who's really spent his career leading at that level of how do you transform from an economic and community development standpoint in the public sector as well as now in the nonprofit sector. David, we want to come to you and hear how you see these issues and see addressing them.
Yeah, thanks so much, Seth. It's great to be part of this panel. And I just want to build on, I think, a number of the things that Eric said in terms of looking at it really from more of the community level. So our work is really focused on community development on the far south side of the city, so in the Pullman and Roseland communities. And our perspective is really to look at community development from that holistic standpoint. As Stephanie talked about, I mean, there's not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to dealing with some of these social determinants of health. You have to look comprehensively across the board. You have to think about, in our case, it's place-based strategies. So it's very neighborhood focused. It's focused on developing communities with the intent that as those communities improve, so will those health outcomes. And it's also very asset based. So we look at communities not from the perspective of what are the deficiencies, what are the problems in the community, but what are the assets. And we believe every community has assets, and those assets need to be leveraged. They need to be promoted. So with that, we in our work we've really focused on a number of those kind of key economic areas. We focused on home ownership, so we've developed several hundred units of affordable housing and have promoted home ownership in rehabbing and building new homes. We've provided quality jobs. So one of our big projects has been the Pullman Park development. We've coordinated over $500 million of new investment. We've created over 1,800 new jobs. Many of those jobs have gone to folks within the neighborhood. And then finally, we've focused on small business development, and we have a micro lending platform that makes loans to small businesses. Harris has been a part of that, supporting that. And so we really believe that comprehensive approach is what's needed. And what's most exciting is after having done this for now 10 years, in the Pullman and Roseland community, we are seeing some of those social impacts. So we've seen crime decrease by 52%, violent crime down by 58%. We've seen the number of people living in poverty decrease by 9%. We've seen unemployment decrease by 6%. So it takes this kind of comprehensive, holistic approach. But if it's done strategically and over a consistent period of time, and I think that's really important too. It's not a 2-year, 5-year, even 10-year kind of thing. This is going to take 20, 30 years to really make those kind of long-term changes. But if you do that consistently, there are ways to start to kind of change that. And as Eric said, the key thing here is this racial wealth gap. And until we start to think about bridging and how do we kind of mitigate that racial wealth gap, we're going to continue to have these kind of social problems. So our approach has been very much kind of at the grassroots level and trying to work this kind of from the ground up. But we also need those kind of social policies that support those kind of efforts. So it's got to be a both-and equation.
Thank you so much, David. And we're now going to go to Calmetta Coleman. Calmetta is the SVP at the Chicago Urban League. And after this report, the whole Urban League was thinking about how do we do even more in this moment. And she's going to share some of the ways that they are meeting this moment. Calmetta?
Yes. Hello, everyone. So actually, it started really before the report came out. So as the report was underway, we knew that we were already seeing from the clients who we serve, who include small businesses, students, prospective homeowners, current homeowners, that people were struggling. So whether it meant that they were out of work or that their small business had to be closed so that they were not bringing income, we saw that there was an immediate need that needed to be addressed. So really in late April, we launched the Chicago Urban League COVID-19 Community Help Center. And the purpose there really was to help people be able to access some of the relief funds and efforts that were out there that were available, that we knew that, African-American businesses, small businesses were kind of struggling to actually get some of those resources, didn't necessarily have the wherewithal to go through the processes that were needed to access some of the funding that was available. And so we stepped in to be able to assist with that. And we're also thinking about how do you help people with some of the crises that we can see being on the horizon. So we're talking about housing as people who are homeowners. A lot of times our clients are first-time homeowners and first in their family, first generation, I guess I would say, homeowners, and may actually be sort of barely affording to be able to stay in their home or maintain home ownership. And so a crisis like this, we know, puts them at risk of potentially losing their home. So we immediately began offering virtually foreclosure prevention counseling and really focusing on how to help people navigate through the things that are specific to COVID-19 and those impacts. So our help center can be accessed virtually. So people there, we actually built a dedicated website, which is culcovid19.com, that is designed so that people can easily go in and navigate and be able to set up virtual coaching sessions with our housing counselors, as well as our small business coaching counselors, as well as to access an electronic job board, because we know a lot of people were, like we talked about earlier, you were in the gig economy, that changed the nature of your job, or a lot of jobs actually shuttered, right, or closed. So people were finding themselves out of work. And we know that there has always been a huge disparity in unemployment for African Americans. So this really exacerbated a problem. And so we are continuing to work with various employers to figure out how we can offer opportunities and make sure that while people may not be able to come into our physical facility, that they can access jobs information that's available. Another thing that we saw, Karen mentioned this earlier about youth and with remote learning and the differences that we were seeing for some African American students in terms of the digital divide and how that really impact their ability to really access some of the remote learning. That we know that after school programs shuttered along with after classes, physical classrooms themselves, we were running a number of programs. One is called Empower Youth, which is a partnership with the Lyric Opera, where our students, about 30 students, high school students, had been rehearsing since October for a performance that they were actually worked with the Lyric Opera to write themselves, and were set to deliver on stage in late May. So what we decided immediately, and I really appreciate the partnership of Lyric in this, is that we would not close that program. So while the students could not meet in person, they continued to meet virtually to rehearse and write. And they actually just last week hosted a virtual performance, really using some of the recordings that we were able to make when we were all still, together in person, as well as sharing what it meant to them to be able to still have that connection with each other, particularly with schools being closed and that no longer being available to them, that we were also providing social emotional support to not just those students, but to our broader network. We serve about 1,300 young people every year through our programming. So we have continued to offer them virtually. Actually, every week, we are doing sessions with young people to kind of talk through not just the COVID-19 crisis, but as a couple of people have mentioned, we're in a really important moment historically, and looking at ways to help young people process their feelings. So our help center will offer tutoring and those kinds of things, but also just that opportunity for young people to come together and to be able to help process their feelings. So I want to mention a couple of things that we have coming up that are also resources for African American youth, families, job seekers amid this whole COVID-19 pandemic and the backdrop of everything else that's going on. So I mentioned youth. We have coming up on June 18th, we're going to be hosting a virtual Black Youth Summit, where we're going to actually invite not just our clients, but students across the city, high school students, to come together. And the youth actually have asked for this and have told us that they want a forum to talk about youth and police relations, to talk about the ideas of, how do you function and think about going back to school after the coronavirus. So those are some things that we're going to be doing. We are also on June 17th going to be hosting a virtual citywide job fair. We have been holding an annual job fair for probably about the past 6 or 7 years, that usually we see, thousands, up to 6,000 people attend. This year is a lot different, but we still wanted to be able to bring those opportunities to people, even though we can't be, physically, people don't have to get dressed up and come out to a job fair to meet with employers. But so far we have about 30 employers who will be hosting virtually, and will be the opportunity for people to come and interview for jobs and send in their resumes. So we're trying to make sure that we can still have these essential resources that people need, and actually need even more now that we're all dealing with COVID-19 available. So those are some things that we're doing, and we are just excited and pleased to be able to provide service continually. So we're despite the digital divide, we're thankful for the technology that allows us to be able to do this.
Well, so we have about 3 minutes left, and I want to get back to each of our speakers for a parting 30-second or less power round answer. And we got in the chat box a couple questions, and they had to do with prioritization. You know, there's so much that needs to be accomplished. How do you prioritize? And so the question for each of you is this: as we look to the new normal after COVID, what is one element, one idea, one change you'd like to see? And you know, that's in my mind your prioritization. What do you see as the top thing that you'd like to see change as we get back to that new normal in the shortest form possible? Stephanie, as our author for the report, can we start with you, and then we're going to go across the group?
Oh my goodness, we can. That's a tremendous challenge. I just want to say this. Let me preface it, and I'll keep it in 30 seconds. We have long known about how the impact of sort of deindustrialization in the 70s and 80s really changed the landscape of work. I actually think we're in a critical moment right now where how we envision work, what work looks like, the jobs that we are going to work, and the access that Black workers and workers of color have to this new world that is going to be created is a critical question that we need to be thinking about right now. And really, I urge all of us to think about this moment in that same life-changing way. Retrospectively, we thought about what happened in the 70s and 80s. I do think that this is where we are right now. So really thinking about workforce and what that's going to mean for workers, especially Black workers and workers of color, is the absolute critical thing we have to be thinking about right now.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a very intimidating role model for the others who have to give their parting shot. Mayor Karen, can we ask you?
So I would say that it is the removal of barriers across the board. You know, I sometimes like to push back on the premise that we can't do it all at once, because we certainly have the resources to do a lot. And so whether you're in the housing sector, whether you're in employment, business, we all know the barriers that exist for Black folks. I would say that we have to use our power in the right way to remove those barriers and have the collective will to do that, both in the public and private sector.
Eric, can we come to you?
I'm going to echo exactly the sentiment that Mayor Karen just shared in saying that as part of our economic recovery, it has to be transformative. It has to be broad in terms of how we address some of the underlying challenges that we've had from a budget standpoint, whether it's the underfunded pension liabilities, but we're going to have to fundamentally address the loss of revenue that we've seen. And doing that, we have to make sure that we don't make deep cuts or have unintended consequences in communities of color that have already been impacted in such a dire way for far too long. And so this will require partnership and us working together to tackle some very important issues.
David?
Yeah, I would say just kind of building on that, I think continued investment in neighborhoods is going to be most important. I think you are going to see shifts downtown in terms of the way people work, and there's going to be more people working from home. So I do think that continued investments in our neighborhoods, whether it's providing affordable housing or other kind of retail options, is going to be critical. And I hope and pray that you know, we can bridge this this tale of two cities and bring our city into more equitable development.
Calmetta?
I can say that everybody else stole my answer, but I'll go down a little deeper in that. I would say that if there were one thing that I think could have a big impact on communities and Black families is increased access to capital for Black small business owners. And we see that as just a major problem. And that is a key way that we can help create more jobs in the Black community, you know, as well as strengthen our communities overall. So I think that I hope will be a part of the new normal is just increased access to funding.
Well, so I will just close by saying that when we started to notice the lives lost during COVID, we literally pulled the plug from our economy and were willing to take very drastic measures. And there were real lives on the line, and we know over 100,000 people have already been lost. But if you look at the social determinants that Stephanie talked about, and you look at the death gap, we actually know that based on human decisions, we lose millions of lives every year. And so I think just to speak to what everyone said in their final remarks, this idea of the urgency of transformation, and this moment tells us that we are willing to do that, and we're willing to do it if we are called to protect human life. And if we can just stop the desensitization that we have felt for so long that we forget that millions of lives are being lost every year because of human decisions, and we can use this moment to recognize and be called to that, you know, there really is an opportunity for transformation. And so I'll just add that to the voices that have already spoken, and thank everyone here. As I looked over the list of RSVPs, so many of you are leading this movement for transformation, and we're grateful to be in partnership with you. Thanks to our incredible speakers, and let's all hope that as we look forward, we will achieve a new normal after this moment. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks.